The extraordinary thing is evidence in the case that's going on in New York at the moment, that they went out, somebody in the mob crossed them up, he was on the dip or whatever, and he had to be got rid of. So they go and brutally murder him, and then they all go to the funeral, and then they turn around and they give money to the widow, and they take care of the kids, because that's like the decent thing to do. Extraordinary double think.
Oh, it's unimaginable to think about how psychologically insane this is. I mean, I've sat at a wedding where the man across me was a killer. He killed the husband of the woman sitting next to me. And everyone at the table knew it. No one said a word about it because you were afraid of any kind of repercussions. And yet everyone sits there in small talks, and you're sitting in the midst of killers and circumstances that would drive just about anyone insane. And so you live in this kind of pressure cooker and waiting to see if something's going to happen, and you keep your mouth shut. So it's a circumstance and a legacy that no one should have to live in.
The day the mafia ship really came home was the day they realized that if you can control the unions, you control America. And you can, as long as you control a union, you can put people out of business, you can get people into business, you can put their competitor out of business. So that gives rise to the protection rackets, and that gave rise eventually to Hoffa and the Teamsters, who really ran America and so on. Tell your viewers and the people in the studio about the two little barbers who refused to join the union.
Well, I think that typified circumstances in the 1930s when the mob was going in and really strong-arming and literally beating people up. We're talking about men who spent their lives in their profession. In this case, they were trying to get under control the Barbers Union in Chicago. And they literally would pay visits to these barbers. And if they weren't willing to vote for the union, they would get beat up. They may get their fingers broken. They may get their legs broken. They may be killed. So they viciously started to get people to sign up for the union, feeling that if they had everybody as a member of the union, then they could mobilize the funds and mobilize the vote. And particularly we talk about the time my own grandfather, which was remarkable. Everybody in my family somehow seemed to be connected in some fashion, but my grandfather was a man who worked on the docks by the railroad, unloading fruit from California, needed some additional work, and my uncle called on him to go do a job. He went with some other men who were enforcers, killers, and went to a barber shop. And here are two older men in the back room after a day's work having to encounter thugs, killers. And what transpired was that they wanted them to vote for the union. And because they weren't, they literally beat these men up, broke their fingers, and an unimaginable situation.
And how old were these men?
These men were into their 50s and 60s. And so they had already, had been along and around for a long time, and this was in their own community. These weren't strangers. So the bottom line on that particular incident was my grandfather couldn't stomach that and wound up going out in front, saying that he thought he heard something and he was looking out front to see if anybody was coming, and he realized at that moment that life was not his, and I think he was a real hero for that because he continued to work in an honorable way, and I think is an example on how sometimes the mob asks you to do things that you may not feel correct.